This is Henry Chamberlain, and I am speaking with Charles Johnson, a distinguished novelist. You may have read Middle Passage, which won the National Book Award. He's also a professional cartoonist, and he happens to be part of a group show, Chicago Comics. And this book came out of Chicago Comics. Chicago Comics, and I'll repeat that later again, is at the Museum of Contemporary Art. It begins this weekend, June 19th, and runs through October 3rd, 2021. And this book, Its Life as I See It, is an offshoot of Chicago Comics, which focuses on Black cartoonists. And so thanks so much for doing this, Dr. Johnson.
Well, thank you, Henry. I mean, this is a pleasure for me, and I really want to thank you for the time and devotion and care that you direct towards our comic artists here in America. We're, a kind of unknown breed for the public, in terms of the public for the most part. So yeah, I really appreciate your work.
Well, I take that to heart. I really enjoy the fact that you're so accessible. Of course, that comes from being a professor so many years. Now, I wanted to jump around talking about Black humor and Charlie's Pad, and also about the interconnections between the world of comics and the world of creative writing. They're very distinct, very different worlds, and yet they're both forms of expression. And so I think there's a lot of interconnections. A lot of cartoonists were journalists, or they have some sort of journalistic inclination. So you know what I mean. Would you
I
like
do.
to speak about that very fact that there's that interconnection between writing and drawing, and they're just so mixed together, and some cartoonists end up becoming writers and full-fledged writers, very distinguished writers.
Oh yes, absolutely. John Updike is a name that comes to mind.
Yeah.
He was doing comic art when he was in college at Harvard. And I remember him saying that he never felt more satisfaction than after he'd done a drawing, more so than even the literary fiction that he was writing. And I think I understand why he felt that way. Let me just say that in terms of creativity, we have a tendency to put people in little boxes sometimes. We'll say, oh, this person's a poet, this person is a novelist, this person is a playwright. But in terms of the individual artist, it isn't the case that you put your creativity in boxes like that. Those are artificial boxes. Let's put it that way. There's a book I'd like to recommend to anybody seeing this show. It's called The Writer's Brush, edited by Don Friedman, and it's 200 years worth of the visual art, the sculpture, the drawings by famous writers like Tennessee Williams, even Harriet Beecher Stowe. I have two pages in there,
Oh,
and he has a website too, um, called the Writer's Brush. And there were two shows that when the book came out, The Writer's Brush, that were in New York at the time at different galleries. So an artist may get up one day and he may think, oh, I want to do a drawing, or he might get up the next day and say, I've been thinking a little bit about the question of cultural appropriation. Let me see if I can write an essay, or in other words, it's global. Creativity is global in the life of an artist, and these things overlap. Now, I started out, as a journalist and so forth in high school. I published my first works, three short stories, 1965, and some illustrations for a magic company catalog in Chicago. A friend of mine hit me to the fact that he was drawing for the company, and so I said, I want to do it too. I would draw for anybody. I mean, all I wanted to do was draw and publish. Um, and I majored in journalism, as an undergraduate. But literature I read all the time because it fed my imagination as an editorial cartoonist, as a panel cartoonist, and I did every kind of comic art you could imagine. Um, for a period of 7 years. Hundreds and hundreds of drawings for my college newspaper, the Daily Egyptian at Southern Illinois University. For the town paper, I was an editorial cartoonist for the Southern Illinois. It was my passion. Anybody who paid me to draw, I would, or even if they didn't pay me to draw, I would still go ahead and express myself that way. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
We shouldn't put ourselves in little boxes. People all the time when they write about me, they say, "Oh, Charles Johnson, author of Middle Passage." Well, I published 25 books. I mean, there's other books out there, but that one got the National Book Award, so you get that little label or tag put on you.
I hesitate to get off script because there's so much to cover, but I totally that relates so much with me, resonates so much with me because I was a very precocious lad, and I jumped ahead of the pack on some things. I fell back on others because I was just curious about pursuing creative writing and painting and comics, and it becomes a bigger and bigger load the more the more ambitious you get. And I think of some of the names that were circulating around for all those creative writer types, Grace Paley, of course, Donald Barthelme, your name, and I do remember Ox Herding Tale, and I remember the ghost of it because it's been so many years, but it's a very precocious protagonist, which I don't know if that might be like a subversive thing with all the racism to have a proud African American who's very, very precocious and very erudite. Could you speak about that, or am I wrong to say that? Or
Oh, no, no, I think you're right. Oxford and Tale was published in 1982. It was a book nobody wanted at the time. It is a philosophical slave narrative that explores both Western and Eastern philosophy. I have a very educated and literate and expressive protagonist the main character, Andrew Hawkins. He's biracial. He can and does halfway through the book pass for white in order to save his life, in the antebellum South. It was a difficult book for a lot of people because it's dealing with the primary question that drove me when I wrote that book for 5 years, over 5 years, from 75 to 1980, was what is the self? What is the self? It's an exploration of that question of identity and selfhood. And it was rejected as many times as Persig's Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It really wasn't a novel that fit within any kind of mold at the time. It was published in 1982. It's been around. People teach it today. It was just taught to a class, I know that, in creative writing at Skidmore College. And I did a Zoom, with a teacher and the students, and also the president of the university, whose name is Mark Connor, because he was my former student at the University of Washington long ago in the 1980s. So the book has legs, it had legs, and it prepared me to be able to write Middle Passage, which is about 20% less complex, less ambitious, than Oxherding Tale.
well, let me go over to some images, which I think will be fun, and introduce the viewers to your work. Of course, this is the book, and these are some of your cartoons. And of course, the book is named after this particular cartoon. It's Life as I See It, and this is 1969. The book published 1970. And I'll just go through these. Watts,
Right.
and then this one really struck me. Do you have a date for tomorrow's riot? And just imagine if this cartoon were to appear today by contemporary cartoonists. I wonder what the reaction would be. Why can't you be more constructive? If you end discrimination, what do you replace it with? That one just seems so surreal, absurd, very silly. He bought them all so he could set them free. um, and then we jump over because I want to make sure people understand that you love cartooning and you still do it to this day.
Oh, yeah.
And that brings us over to Emery's world. But I wanted to go back to the tone of these cartoons, the droll sense of humor. Do you think we've lost something? Maybe today's And I'm not trying to step on any toes, as a sake of argument, do you think maybe a younger audience might be less receptive to silliness like this?
Well, I mean, the cartoons have, I think, incongruity, um, and they were done over 50 years ago. I drew in a week of passionate outpouring. What was it, 89 cartoons for my first book, Black Humor, in a week. I cut my classes. I went through 2 bottles of India ink. The ideas just kept coming to me and coming to me and coming to me. I was 1969. Now, a comics scholar who has worked for Comics Journal is Tim Kreider, who is a really fine editorial cartoonist.
Yeah.
He recently did a piece on Don Rickles when he passed away from the New York Times. Kreider did another essay too on my cartoons when he discovered black humor. I think the title is um, "Better in Hindsight." I mean, so many years later, right? Because his argument is because he's younger than me, and he didn't, he wasn't grown up in the late '60s, early '70s. When he looks at the humor that we had in that period, right? The
Yeah.
early '70s, he feels it was much freer. You could have a Don Rickles, okay?
Yeah.
You could have Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles with the kind of humor that had with Richard Pryor. It was a whole different era. Now, I really have the feeling that people wear their feelings right there, on their sleeve. People are easily offended. They're not very generous. They're maybe they're afraid of humor. Sometimes, when you talk about something being funny, well, it all depends on whose ox is being gored, in
Hmm.
a particular editorial cartoon. But I think in the early '70s, we hadn't drifted quite into the rigidity that we seem to have now in respect to being open and able to laugh at ourselves. This is something that's happened to us in the last 50 years, according to Tim Kreider and according to me.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned Tim, that's he's a very distinct type of cartoonist who does go who tries to cross the line. Sometimes I feel like, ouch, he takes it. Well, I guess if he took it too far, then he would have failed. But he really he pushes the limits in a very interesting way.
Yeah, no, I think cartoonists have always done that. Journalists have, always had to have the courage to go after, things like political corruption. Um, and there are no sacred cows. For the journalist trained the way I was in the '60s, there are no sacred cows. Anything can be the subject of humor and incongruity. And that humor and incongruity can be enlightening. You could say, "Oh, of course," you get the great, oh my God, Bill Malden, his work on Tar Cartoonist in the
Yeah.
'60s, Herb Block, um, the the names, the list could go on and on and on. Sometimes cartoonists are subversive. You've interviewed underground cartoonists, right?
Yeah.
You take on the high and the mighty. You take on the pompous. This
Yeah.
is one of the things that journalists and cartoonists have been doing ever since Thomas Nast. You can go back even further to Damier and Cruikshank and Rowlandson, right? There's a long, distinguished history of comic art in the Western world.
Well, maybe it's well, I'd hate to say that a newer generation has a less of a breadth of knowledge. There might that's a very general statement to make. There might be some truth to that.
Less of a breadth of knowledge. Could you say what
Well,
you mean?
well, like they might not be aware of the history of satirical comics and satire to the point where they it's all so new to some some people.
Maybe so, but I grew up on Mad Magazine. right?
Yeah.
Um, that's a satire publication. Uh,
Yeah.
I'll just say this: my daughter's boyfriend is a really nice guy, and he's an artist. I remember he looked at my cartoons, and he thought, because he wanted to know, what they showed him about history, right? 50 years ago, because that's when the cartoons were done. But I remember him making a remark. He thought they were crass, because I go after everybody. They're that's just what cartoonists do.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm getting at. But then these are more gentle as far as I can tell. Emery's World is more for the kids.
Yeah,
And there's one of the covers, and this is a project that you're involved with your daughter, which looks
we we
great.
we co-author the Adventures of Henry Jones, Boy Science Wonder, YA Young Adult books, and there's three so far. That's the first one. I've done that cover three times. Oh, over three times, for different editions. Um, and it gives me a chance to draw. I can, this book has about 10, 10 illustrations. The next one, called The Hard Problem, I had 20. And then in the third book that just came out recently, the Tomorrow No One Wanted, I did about 17 cartoons. And it was a chance to give myself the opportunity to draw. When I was a college professor, English professor, no one was going to give me promotion or tenure for drawing cartoons. So I had to do criticism and literary scholarship and novels and stories and so forth. But I never stopped drawing. That for me was, it's too much of a joy and a pleasure.
And during the panel discussion with Dan Nadel, you guys were talking about influences. George Harriman, of course, came up, and George Harriman, I think, was very interesting in so many ways. The fact that for the sake of his own life, for his own safety, he had to pass for white, and to progress through his career, he had to pass for white, and yet it seems like he was doing it in plain sight. And it seems like he was sort of playing with it in plain sight in his comic. Now, there's no way to know, but do you suppose that in the Black community they knew that, hey, this cartoonist is Black, or were they even thinking that maybe?
That's a good question. I have written in various places about Harriman and Crazy Cat, Ignatz Mouse, Officer Pup there. Um, that was one of the great experimental, comics of another era. Very, very influential. Now, Harriman always wore, from what I've read, a hat because his hair was kind of curly and kind of kinky. So even indoors, he would wear a hat, I've
Yeah.
read. But I do know that probably back in the 60s, maybe, there were people in the Black community, the Black art community, who knew that Harriman um, had, a Black ancestry or origin. Um, but yeah, that if you look at the strip, I don't think you can really find race in it. I don't think you can really find, issues of black or white. Some people have maybe tried to interpret it that way. But it's just delightful, very fresh entertainment.
Well, there. I guess if you if you keep digging and digging, because there's moments when Crazy Cat will say something very sly, like, "Oh, I wish I was white," in so many words. Uh, and I wish I had a perfect example to show you, but it just leaves you wondering.
Well, I guess so. You're
Yeah,
right. Oh,
I don't have my perfect example. And then you guys also mentioned Ollie Harrington,
oh yes.
who's it's sort of like the other side. This is an artist who was honoring Black people, drawing people that were just real people, and avoiding the stereotypes.
Look at the draftsmanship in this Dark Laughter cartoon.
Yeah,
Ollie Harrington was so-called dean of black political cartoonists. and his draftsmanship is just exquisite. I met him, and I'll tell
Oh.
you a little story about that. It was 1989. For the U.S. Information Agency, I was giving lectures in four countries. I started in Germany. That was when the wall was coming down, okay, between East and West Germany. And then I
Hmm.
went on to Czechoslovakia, lectured there, then went to Portugal and wound up in Paris at a writers' conference where I read. But back in Berlin, where they worked me very hard, I spent 7 hours one day lecturing about Black literature, all the way through lunch. I mean, it was just long. But somebody told me, Ali Harrington is here. Would you like to meet him? Now, here's the story. Harrington left America because of racism and segregation, and maybe his life was in danger, and went to Paris. And he hung out with writers over there like Chester Himes and Richard Wright.
Mm.
He decided at one point that it would be nice to have a translation of great classic literature in German. In German. So he went to East Berlin to argue, pitch that idea, and the wall came up. He was
Mm.
trapped. He was trapped there until 1989. He lost his Paris apartment, and I guess he could only really draw for the Communist Press. So anyway, I met him in a cafe for coffee, in Berlin. I had two questions for him that I'd always wondered about. The first question was, why did Richard Wright write hundreds and hundreds of haiku? What was up with that, right? I mean, why haiku? And he just responded casually, well, he was a genius, and geniuses get up and decide they want to do something one day. But my second question for him was, when you were in America, where did you publish? And he said, that's the point. There was no place for him to publish except the black press. Those places had published the other nine cartoonists, right, who are in It's Life as I See It. But I mean, look at his work. I mean, it's just, it's beautiful in detail, composition, figure drawing, balance. Yeah, this is nice.
Um, well, the two questions that I was thinking of framing this interview with, and then I saw the thing that Brian McDonald did, and it kind of blew my sails away. Was I was going to talk about Black humor, but you've already talked about that in that video, and then Charlie's pad. But still, I'm one of the things I like to do is try to delve in and get like a little bit of juicy insider information. Now, Black humor, we I think is becoming known among us comics aficionados. It was spurred by Amiri Baraka. But were you also maybe thinking, well, if the New Yorker's not going to publish me, they're going to go out anyway, and who knows, maybe the New Yorker will take notice. Was the New Yorker kind of hovering around a lot for
Hmm.
folks, or were they just like done with it and they're going to just do their own thing?
Well, I think people were just going to do their own thing because the New Yorker did not publish Black
Yeah.
cartoons in the late '60s. They didn't even publish my mentor, cartoonist Lawrence Laurier, who was he published like 100 books. I took his 2-year course in drawing when I was like 15 and 16, and finished it when I was 17. And that's when I started publishing drawings and stories. Now, Laurier was the cartoon editor every year, Best Cartoons of the Year. He did murder mysteries, some of them under 3 different pseudonyms. He was a Disney idea man, not an illustrator, but an idea man. Um, and yeah, he was kind of like my mentor at that time, but they didn't publish him, and he would complain about the New Yorker for that reason. Now, in terms of black humor, bear in mind in the late 1960s, there were no black professors at the college I went to, no black faculty. So the black graduate students got together and invited Baraka to campus to give a reading. And I remember going to his reading. He was flanked on both sides by bodyguards. And at the end of his reading, during the Q&A, he said he wouldn't take any questions. from white people. And I thought that was kind of rude, all right, but okay, no question. So all the white members of the audience were quiet. But he said to the black students, take your talent home to the black community. Now, I've been drawing for a few years for every kind of publication. White characters, I didn't care. It just didn't matter. Whatever the assignment was. But I felt he was talking to me. And suddenly, at the end of the lecture, I walked back to my dorm. It was raining. In the rain, and all these ideas flooded into my brain in terms of everything I knew about Black history, Black culture, Black Americans that didn't appear anywhere
Mm.
in the publications, like the New Yorker. So that motivated me for a week to spend that intense, 7 days drawing. And that's how Black humor came about.
Well, I won't belabor that. We'll move right along to Charlie's pad. To me, that just seems like such an amazing experience. Of course, that's long ago, and you're probably thinking, why is he bringing that up? But for you to be there at the beginning of PBS and to be able to do your own how to do comics show at such a young age, that must have been like so mind blowing.
Well, think again back to the late '60s. A couple of things. At the school I was going to, there was something called free school, and free school was a place where any student who had a skill or a talent could teach other people. They would just give you a room assignment and you met with your students. Well, I did a cartooning course for a handful of people in free school, as well as I said, drawing for the campus paper and the town paper, the Southern Illinois. So one day I'm sitting in my dorm room bored, just bored. So I decided to write to the local PBS station, WSIU TV, and I said, "You've probably seen my work in the school paper and the town paper, and would you be interested in a course in cartooning?" I didn't expect them to write back to me. They did, and they asked me to come in. I talked about what I do. Now I based that show, Charlie's Fan, on the lessons I had in my mid-teens on cartooning from Lawrence Laurier. There were 52 15-minute drawing lessons, one for every week of the year. Some stations were able to use it in a two of them together in a 30-minute block, or they put four of them together, for an hour. And here's the thing: I didn't know when I wrote to the station that the year before Congress had approved the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That meant PBS stations all over the country were hungry for content. So when I wrote to them, the show was perfect because it was cheap. All they had to have was me at a drawing table with two cameras looking at them. And so I would come in and we would shoot maybe three at a time, three shows at once. And it was on the air in 1970. It showed all over the country for about 10 years. And somebody told me once in Canada. But it's so old. I mean, you're not going to see it anywhere because, they cleaned out all the reels and everything. But I do have a promotional reel with three shows on it. And I don't look at it because I was like 21 years old. It looks like an animated high school, an animation of my high school picture. But yeah, I did that show. And then when I was done, well, I realized something very important about me, that I would much rather be behind the camera, writing a script or, doing something creative that way than in front of the camera. I didn't, it just took away from me any interest in being in television anymore.
Well, if you you ever think about it, you might want to put that on YouTube, or maybe that'll be too painful. I'd like to see it.
I've had people ask me if I'm going to resurrect it. I really have moved on.
Oh, of course.
That was 50 years ago, so I'm doing something different now.
Well, my interviews are pretty free and easy, so I don't want to keep you much longer, I did want to maybe do a little bit of housework here and mention the Charles Johnson papers have been acquired by Washington University in St. Louis. Is there something that comes to mind about that? I'm sure you're looking forward to that process.
Well, it took 2 years to organize all that material and to get it itemized, all of it, and then to find the exact right home for it. And Washington University turned out to be the perfect place for it. There's, that archive has got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Everything I published, cartoons. I mean, it's all. I was a pack rat, and it's got unpublished cartoons and drawings. So it should be of interest to the people on the illustration faculty at Washington U, as well as the literary faculty. They're very excited about it. I'm very happy that they are going to be stewards, for 56 years worth of literary and visual, art.
Well, I think I know when to stop. I kind of wanted to talk about screenwriting, but that's a whole other world. Let me just say that this is at this show is at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the offshoot is It's Life as I See It. And if there's anything else you wanted to add, please feel free.
Well, I just urge people, if you're in the Chicago area or going there, to see the show. There is rich material that is going to be on exhibit by 9 cartoonists. Some who got to be well known, like Maury Turner. He had the first black syndicated comic strip, and Jackie Orns is her work is there, and mine. Yeah, it's kind of like a window into time, a visual experience, like going back into the past, and it's very educational.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.